Hello everybody, Adrian Plass here.
Yes, and Bridget, hello.
And it is number 222 in Sounding the Jolly Old Shadows.
I'd almost forgotten what that was all about in the first place, but I know it was to do with the fact that Paul, on his journey, they nearly shipwrecked, and then they did shipwreck, but they had to work out how deep the water was. And if you remember, when we first started all that time ago, the idea was we were reaching the shore. Yeah. And I think for many, many of us that never quite felt as though we'd reached the shore, if we're telling the truth, that it was something far more complex than that after COVID, and then after crisis, some of us still feel we're wading around and haven't quite got anywhere, really.
Maybe the shore was always a bit of a myth.
Yeah, maybe it was.
Possibly it was.
Maybe it was.
It was for me. The other night, not night before last, I can't remember, this week,
right,
on the night that the great debate between Kamala Harris and Trump was supposed to happen, I stayed up because they kept saying we're going to hear the debate in a minute or in a whatever, and it turned out it was about 4 or 5 hours after that. So I never actually saw it live, and I think I'm glad, really. But I did find it absolutely fascinating to see these two people who obviously had discussed the way they were going to approach it very carefully. Well, I don't know if Trump did, but I'm sure she did. How they would handle it, how they would deal with the person, because when there's no audience. So for Trump, no one to play with the audience. And Kamala Harris, a bit low on detail in her presentation. But what she did do was to needle Trump very specifically and very effectively, so that he started talking about the most ridiculous things that he supposed were happening. And you realize that the truth in all this was more about what you thought of somebody than the things they actually said, although they, I suppose, were important.
I think that's interesting, Adrian, because I know one commentator afterwards said deep down it comes down to the person, number one, that you like most, and number two, that you think will help you the most. And that those are the sort of things, and they're not really to do necessarily with policies, they're to do, or truth even, they're to do with how you communicate yourself and how you communicate what you think will be good about you and what you think people will like about you and go for.
It was very interesting that they had fact checkers involved in this debate.
So I bet they wish they hadn't.
Well, Kamala Harris won't mind, because Trump made a ridiculous comment about people eating other people's animals, was one, and they contacted the state where that was supposed to have happened. It was complete nonsense. But he was picked up on a few things. She actually, I'm afraid I can't remember precisely what they were, but she made 2 statements that were untrue.
Did she?
And she was not checked.
Oh, okay.
She was not corrected on that.
No.
But if you were asking me the difference between them, this may be a somewhat prejudiced view, I would say her chief quality is that she's not Donald Trump. As I think an awful lot of people, but in America that is not true, because 80 million people or something still believe that he is the savior of America. So what will happen? They're pretty well neck and neck, and there's only 3 states, really 3 or 4 states that it's possible could change. And that's how the presidential victory occurs. So,
yeah, and I mean, a bit of a contrast to that, but I'm just thinking about communicating what you think is your truth, or not even believing it yourself, but choosing what you're going to say in order to attract people. And that isn't necessarily talking about what it says on the tin, really, talking about the facts. You're selecting out of the facts things that you think might appeal. And it was interesting because last last week we were at something that was held in Stroud called Book Blessed, weren't we? And it was writers who were talking about their writing.
About 20
20 writers talking about their writing.
Yeah.
Talking about how they take what they want to communicate and make it attractive enough for people to want to read. And then quite a lot of talk about authenticity. And you chose to tell a story that was all about trying to communicate some truth. And you used the phrase, what it says on the tin, didn't you? That somehow, when we come to communicating what we believe, very often we can say the words, but actions don't quite follow it up.
That's right.
Go on.
And there is a big problem with chiefs and Indians. I mean, the chiefs can say what they like, but the Indians, well, I'm not sure you're supposed to say that anymore. But
anyway, I'd love you to tell that story, because it's so long ago, but it was true.
It was a story when we lived in Bromley.
Yeah, Bromley it was.
And I went to the supermarket there, which I think was a Safeway. I'm not sure, but something like that. And I went to get sugar. And a friend of mine who worked as a manager in Safeway told me that they hide the sugar in supermarkets so that you buy all sorts of other crap while you're looking for the sugar. So as I was going through the aisle, into the body of the shop, I saw a sign on the wall which said, as far as I can remember, Safeways will be warmly grateful to customers who report breakages and spillages in the aisles. So I happened to register that. Went and found my sugar wherever that turned out to be, in some strange corner of the supermarket. But on the way back, I found a wonderful breakage or spillage. It was one of those big glass jars of piccalilli sauce.
That's
and
right.
it had smashed on the floor, so it was everywhere.
So it was in the pickle aisle, wasn't it?
In the pickle aisle. So
yes.
I thought, I'm going to report this and get some warm gratitude from Safeways. So childish.
How naive are you?
I know.
Yes.
So I went to the 12 items or less queue. As usual, I counted the items in the basket of the lady in front of me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, 12, 13. Which thought, this is awful. You cannot do this. I've got sugar. Anyway, got past that.
Got past that part of you, that judgmental part of you, yeah.
Got to the girl on the till, who was about 9, I seem to recall. And after I'd paid for my sugar, I said casually, and I'd rehearsed this sentence in my mind, I said, oh, by the way, I just wanted to let you know that there is a rather serious breakage in the pickle aisle. And I waited for my warm gratitude, and she said, no. And then she pressed a button, and a young man, probably about 15, wearing a green trilby hat, came along. And he said, what? And she said, a customer complaining about a breakage in the pickle aisle. I said, I did not, but he'd gone. And I heard him shout, breakage in the pickle aisle. And then, I swear, there were voices diminishing as they disappeared into the far background. And eventually a subhuman member of staff, probably a university student on vacation, came out and started clearing it up. And I thought, this is not right.
You felt strongly.
I felt very strongly. So still clutching my sugar, I found that young man, and I said to him, look, I wasn't complaining. I was reporting a breakage in the pickle aisle, and it says on that sign over there, you'll be warmly grateful if I report it. So I'd like some warm gratitude, please. And he said, well, you don't have to clear it up, do you? I suppose if the managing director of Safeway had been there, he might have said, we'd like to thank you on behalf of the entire board of Safeway and all the entire organisation for reporting that breakage, but he wasn't, and he didn't. So I didn't get my word. But the point was that you have a huge sign saying that something is true and will happen. And then when you go to get it, obviously I was a bit provocative, when you go to get it, it isn't there. And when you have corporate groups of people, the church is a very good example.
Well, I think hype in politics,
hype in politics,
in communication about religion, hype in this ridiculous debate, if you like, you know. Is it real? Is it true?
I know. You need some useful metaphors, and Bridget knows I'm getting a bit boring about C.S. Lewis, but one of his famous metaphors is if you say you become interested in Christianity and you think, I want to be part of that or be involved in it, it is as though you go into a hallway. You go into the hallway, and on your left there are doors in the wall, and in the right there are other doors in the wall. And each of those doors, let's say, leads to a denomination.
Okay.
Or a group or a way of looking at Christian faith. So you then select one of those doors and you find out what's behind it, how those people through there eat or think or work or are. And you decide...
And that becomes the truth for
yes,
you, doesn't
decide,
it?
Well, not necessarily, because you know you've chosen from several.
Oh, okay.
The point he makes is that you've got to start by going into the hall, that you have a desire to be a part of this, and you discover by exploring that there are many ways to approach it, rather than saying I'm going to hunker down in one group or one selection of people and decide that that's how things are done.
But isn't the danger, I mean, I don't know if he explored this, but just hearing you saying that, the danger is that you go through that door and you're welcomed through that door, and you feel you belong in that place, and therefore you accept what they say as being the truth. It must be, because you've chosen it, as you said, and because you're there, and because you're surrounded by people, all of whom believe that. Whether it's a style, and we've often talked about different styles of worship, all of which are valid in their own way, so long as you don't believe it's the only way. And I remember when we were in a very, very charismatic church, the idea that you knelt down in a service would have been seen as bizarre.
Yeah.
Similarly,
or the idea that you didn't raise your arms.
Yes.
Would be bizarre.
And similarly, I was just going to say, and similarly, if you went to a very quiet, suppose it was a Quaker meeting, the idea that you danced around and made a lot of noise would be considered equally bizarre.
But you might, I mean, that's an interesting example, because you might say to yourself, I like this quiet way of doing things. And I think the Quakers don't have a view as such in the way that perhaps other groups. But I've been trying to formulate one of the things that has been fortunate for us, I think, is that we've travelled so much, not just in this country, but
ironically
around the world.
Very slowly now, but we did.
But around the world, and we've seen every kind of church you can imagine. And I think because of that, you don't land on anything in particular, but you gather great stuff from many, many different ways of looking at things. And it's very hard to say this is the way you do it, because you know there are many ways to do it. So I'm really glad about that. Yeah,
and in a way that maybe you could say, going to this writers thing and meeting all these different writers, that they have all individually chosen a way to communicate, which is really very different from each other. I mean, obviously,
I think they have. They had a question session, didn't they? And I suppose one or two people said the same-ish thing, but there was quite a variety of responses.
Well, and I mean, if you're talking about writing fiction, you're going to have a different idea of how to communicate the truth, because it won't be the truth, if you like. Not you. If you're not writing something factual, it's not going to be the truth. But your characters need to be true to themselves. The arc of the story needs to have a truth. Needs to have makes sense, really. If you're writing something based on your memory, and there was one person there writing about her friend developing Alzheimer's and searching her own memories to find what was true, what did she really think, what was really happening, what was her response. And in that searching, finding things that I think become almost universal in their application.
It was interesting. Well, I mean, I actually did ask a question. We were down on the floor, weren't we? And my question was about writing what is called Christian fiction, because one of the great problems with writing Christian fiction is that you can make God do anything. You can make God come over the, like the cavalry, come in and solve everything. We know, everybody knows, really, that isn't what happens. And in fact, the older you get, the more you realise that nothing is ever as simple as that.
No, and I mean, if you think of... Oh, sorry. No, what were you going to say? And then, yeah.
So, when you say there's no, the truth in fiction, there is a responsibility in whether it's some other genre. It doesn't matter. Truth has to enter into it, into character. If you do something very bizarre and very different, that's okay. But you still know that there will be a contextual truth that allows them to live properly as people.
Yeah, which if you think about a lot of soaps, you often find that the character is apparently completely changed.
Well,
and they read their script and they have to be a completely different person for a month or two. And then maybe some crisis will happen in their life and they'll go off to be something else.
Remember that series Heartbeat about the Yorkshire village with the police people?
Yes.
A doctor died every 3 months, I think, because the actress moved away, or one of the policemen also died, and
when the ratings are going down, kill somebody off.
Yes. People did things that were way out of character, and we were very naively saying, but he wouldn't do that. He'd never do that. So I must say, I remember when I wrote a book called The Sacred Diary of Adrian Price, and when I wrote that, one of the first times I read it to any public group, a young man afterwards said to me, he said, it was quite funny. So I said, oh, good. He said, but I don't think people who are not involved with the church should read it. And I said, why is that then? He said, well, because they might think we really are like that. And really, he'd hit the very centre of the problem, that we are like that.
Well, of course we are.
And the fact that I was slightly loony at the time meant that instead of using the positive superlatives that are commonly used in Christian, no, that's not true, but in a lot of Christian fiction, I was actually talking about what happens to you, and that was what made the difference in the end, I think.
I mean, you were inspired, I was inspired, many people were, by some amazing books written about some people who did really amazing things, like God's Smuggler, smuggling Bibles, crossing the Switchblade. What there, I think, where the distortion lay, was not in the fact that those things didn't happen, because they did. There was a moment, wasn't there, in God's Smuggler where he's crossing a border and he's got a case full of Bibles and the guard doesn't see them. And we've heard ourselves many extraordinary examples of things like that. But what wasn't allowed in those books was the gaps, all the periods where nothing happened. And we were thinking, weren't we, about Paul and how he, St. Paul, if you like, and how occasionally there's great gaps where he stays in one place for a very long time and clearly not a lot happened.
Yeah, that's right.
And the gaps are the truth as well. And somehow that is a very difficult thing sometimes to communicate, because those gaps are quite...
It's the same with Jesus, isn't it? I mean, the stories, obviously he told 1,000 times, which is why people remember them, the parables. But there's loads of stuff. But speaking of Paul's CV, as he expressed it, was one of suffering, interestingly. When it was a little...
it's quite a list.
Yeah, it was a list of horrible things that had happened to him. But Paul was born out of the fire of letting down somebody he actually wanted to follow. And for him, and this I think doesn't apply to many people, in some sense he was, I don't want to say he was making up for it, but he actively wanted to do the things that would help, and it gave him huge pleasure. Well, I don't think one ought to hold Paul up as how you go about things, but that passion for truth, for saying things the way they are, will always need to be renewed and refreshed. It's like you get books on prayer in the Christian church, and then you get another book on prayer, and then you get the real questions, real answers to questions on prayer.
And rather like you said about the different doors that Lewis was talking about, there will be truths in all of those, especially for that particular person writing it. He will have found what to him is his truth.
Yeah, that's
that
right,
if you praise God for everything, you will be blessed. Or if you suffer, you will be blessed, or you will be following, or you will be... It makes it much more complicated to actually say what's on the tin in a way.
I was very... I'm getting very boring about Lewis, I know at the moment, but his experience of...
Whose experience?
Lewis's experience.
C.S. Lewis, right, yeah.
Of one of the great Christian apologetics, of speaking to ordinary people, as he put it, was that he had such huge scholarship and such an immense literary capability and an amazing mind. He had to learn to talk to people. So the truth that he propounded at university, which was very clever, he really managed to make some of the most obscure aspects of medieval literature clear and accessible to people. But when he had to talk to people in the Royal Air Force who were about to go to war, and then on the radio during the war he made very famous broadcasts, and he had to really totally adapt the way the truth was presented to people
while keeping his own self
absolutely
true,
yeah,
not putting on a funny voice presumably,
no,
or trying to be a lad with the lads, because I think all of us can fall into terrible traps of thinking you need to not be yourself, but finding a way to find. Yeah, it's really that's an interesting challenge.
He was
in
a
itself.
master of the metaphor, of course.
Yeah.
So he really found ways within the culture that he was speaking that helped him to speak to them. And he actually said, "You must know your audience or your readership." And I think he wouldn't have said that a few years before that.
And you go back to Jesus, don't you? He knew his readership. He knew one of the things about Kamala Harris, we were told, was just she was baiting Trump. She was needling him. And that, is a good precedent with Jesus and the Pharisees, and the teachers of the law. He knew how to needle them.
Oh, he was brilliant at it, yeah. Who is my brother? And then telling a story that really annoys somebody.
Yes.
And then saying, so tell me, who do you think now is your brother?
Yeah.
And he couldn't even say the word Samaritan as
No.
So he always left space for people to find the truth, not because he said, here's the truth. He said, listen to this construct, this story.
And I think that was why it was such a joy being with all these writers,
Yeah,
to
it
hear
was, actually.
their way of telling a story, whatever the story was, and making it something that was true to themselves and would have a truth for other people, whether it was fiction, whether it was biography, whether it was using the Bible to stimulate stories, whatever it was.
No, it was fascinating. Anyway, we went on a bit about that, didn't we? Never mind.
We quite enjoyed it.
I quite like the truth. I find truth very interesting. One day I might even achieve it properly.
And it would be lovely to hear, as always, to hear from you, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Bye-bye.